Hello, everybody. Welcome to Left on Right, where we give the left-wing perspective on right-wing media. Today, we are reacting to Tim Pool on the deportations of illegal immigrants. Tim passionately argues that the left and the judiciary are lying and being unreasonable. How could we have 2-year hearings for every deportation for illegal immigrants? However, a calm reading of the evidence that he himself presents reveals what he says to be misleading. Tim Pool's emotional. He's angry. He's outraged. You should read that as an attempt to manipulate you, not that he's being truthful. Let's jump into Tim Pool.
This is being, once again, factual but not truthful. The Democrats are stepping up and saying Donald Trump is speaking like a dictator. Heavens me, no due process. My friends, I'd like to inform you of one simple fact. I've got the U.S. government website pulled up. Illegal immigrants don't get trials. They get hearings. That's always been the case. And Trump's argument is the judiciary is arguing that each individual have an actual trial, which could take upwards of 2 years.
All right, so already this is inaccurate. So the basic point here, if you want the high-level summary, is when you deport somebody, there's expedited removal and regular removal. So expedited removal typically applies to the case where you are detaining somebody close to the border, and in that case, you can just kick them out of the country right away. However, if someone has been here longer, they're in the center of the country, they are entitled to more rights in terms of their ability to appeal things. So nobody's arguing what Tim Pool is saying here. And the specific case of Abrego Garcia that he is talking about, Trump knew that he couldn't just deport those people under expedited removal under normal circumstances. So he invoked the Alien Enemies Act, which is a very rarely invoked process, only been done a couple times since its creation in 1798. So already Tim Pool is misleading you based on what he's saying that people are claiming. Just another thing to think about is the judicial process is extremely detailed in terms of arguing different aspects of the law. So it doesn't really make sense that they would just be totally flouting the law. You can read all of the court cases. I've read a fair amount of them. There's a lot of detail in there. It lays out the whole situation pretty clearly. So Tim Pool, you'll see he's going to get more and more emotional as this goes on. And it's just unfortunately not accurate. I don't know what to say.
Trump is saying, stick with the law and have the hearings, but the Democrats have turned this into something else entirely. Now, the issue of mass deportation and what's been going on has been quite contentious for obvious reasons. Abrego Garcia is the story that Democrats won't seem to let go, even though they're losing on the issue of immigration, and most Americans actually want mass deportations.
All right, so he brings up Abrego Garcia. We're going to skip ahead a bit since he's just has some advertisements here. So let's go back to the argument.
The story right away from the New York Times. Trump says undocumented immigrants shouldn't get trials before deportation. The president claimed that countries were sending their prisoners to the U.S. and that he needed to bypass the constitutional demands of due process to expel them quickly. Lie. That's a lie.
I mean, I don't think that's too inaccurate. He invoked the Alien Enemies Act, which is using expedited due process typically when there would be a longer hearing. So it is true that Donald Trump, in this case of the 3 planes and Abrego Garcia, cited a extremely rare wartime law that shouldn't be applied in this case. And that's why there's a big fight over it, is because typically, if you're in this country for longer, you have some more rights to contend if you should be deported or not.
Hey, let's do this. Before you are tainted by the fake news of the New York Times, let me...
Okay. You can see, here's another example of Tim Pool using an emotional appeal. You shouldn't let that get to you. You need to read what's happening in a accurate fashion.
Grant you a bit of the information I have received. Here's USA.gov.
So I am going to say that I think it's good that he is going over this process. The deportation laws are pretty complicated and there's lots of different situations that could go up. So I think it is good to go over this.
Okay, that's a .gov. That's the government. Understand the deportation process. They write, learn how the deportation process works and how to get help if you're facing deportation. Even the government's trying to help you, right? They say, what happens when someone is detained by immigration? They say after a non-citizen is detained, they may go before a judge in immigration court during the deportation removal process. In some cases, a non-citizen is subject to expedited removal without being able to attend a hearing in immigration court. Expedited removal may happen when a non-citizen comes to the U.S. without proper travel documents, uses forged travel documents, does not comply with their visa or other entry document requirements. My friends, they are outright telling you it has always been this way. They sometimes don't even give you a hearing. Okay? That's normal. What?
All right. So I'm going to do is I'm going to actually click into the link here. So if you read the link that's shown right here, learn more about deportation under an order of expedited removal. That actually explains things more accurately. So whether or not you're subject to expedited removal depends a lot on various situations, but the basic point is expedited removal only applies when you're detained near the border. There's been some contention over that, so I'll also discuss that later, but the way Tim Pool's describing this right now just isn't accurate. And if he clicks into that link, which he doesn't, but I'll do, you'll understand more.
Democrats and liberals in the media are doing is reframing the understanding of the deportation process to make it seem that every time you want to deport someone, there's supposed to be a trial, or let alone some kind of hearing. Let me just stress, expedited removal means you don't get a hearing. Now take a
Right, but again, I mean, Tim Pool really is starting to work himself up here. The conditions where there's expedited removal are relatively limited and did not apply in the case of Abrego Garcia. And that is why Trump sought to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and that there's a big battle over that.
look at this. An immigration court of the U.S. DOJ hears the related case. If a judge rules that the deportation should proceed, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement carries out a removal order. Before removal is carried out, you might be able to leave the U.S. at your own expense. This is known as, voluntary departure. You can appeal. They say you may appeal some deportation rulings. Before appealing the ruling, find legal services. You may also be able to find help from a nonprofit legal organization. You can also contact a USCIS office. When you are deported, they're usually carried out by air at U.S. government expense. Others may use a combination of air and ground transport. So let's break this down. If you come here without proper documents, forged or fraudulent documents, or you do not comply with your visa, you're out.
All right, this isn't really accurate. He's just saying it may happen. However, the link here spells out what happens in more detail, so we'll go into that in a bit. But Tim Pool's again getting himself more and more worked up, but he isn't reading the details of when a expedited removal applies.
No hearing. Not even a hearing. That is the normal due process. That is the normal due process.
Normal only under very specific circumstances. So it's really not that normal.
Now, if you are here on a visa and your visa is expiring or it has expired, meaning you did come here legally, but something has changed, you can actually appeal these decisions. You can issue appeals. In the instance of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man who is, Democrats are probably going to build statues for him and write books about him, I bet. This guy didn't, he was ordered for removal of deportation, and he filed for asylum and 2 withholding claims. Asylum was denied. I forgot what the act is called, but there's an anti-torture act, also denied. But he did receive withholding based on fear of death from a rival gang in Guatemala. He was granted that, but he was still ordered to deport.
All right, so so he did, there's like been different things that happened with him over his history, but once he got the ability to stay in the country, he was not ordered to deport. So that is also inaccurate.
This withholding just meant we would not send him to die in El Salvador.
So that's not true. Basically, he was allowed to stay in the country, and he checked in with the courts every year. So this is inaccurate.
Now, Trump says undocumented immigrants shouldn't get trials. This is why I showed you USA.gov first. Now that you understand that context directly from the U.S. government website.
All right, yeah, so let's go into the U.S. government website here. So, all right, we've got this, and so then there's this learn more about deportation under an order of expedited removal. Okay, so here we go. There is the Immigration and Nationality Act, which establishes different removal processes for different categories of aliens. Most removable aliens apprehended within the interior of the United States are subject to formal removal proceedings under the INA. So Tim Pool went on this whole rant about how in most cases there aren't formal removal proceedings, but it's directly contradicted by the page that he cited. So then they go on to say there is a framework for a expedited removal, and there's also a lot more detail here. So let's just go into the basic summary here. So expedited removal. Process used by ICE to remove individuals from the U.S. without a hearing. Traditionally, expedited removal has been used in cases with remove individuals with outstanding removal orders issued by an immigration judge, people who are seeking admission at ports of entry, and individuals who are unlawfully present who are found near the border shortly after arrival. However, Trump has... So that's typically this process applies to when you're close to the border. However, the DHS has published a notice expanding the ability of ICE to remove individuals deemed unlawfully in the U.S. who are unable to prove that they've been in the U.S. for 2 years. Okay. However, that notice faces a legal challenge. So the traditional definition of expedited removal still applies. So if we go back to the Abrego-Garcia case, Trump knew that he couldn't just deport these people under typical processes. Abrego-Garcia was in Maryland for many years, so typical expedited removal would not apply to him. That is why he invoked the Alien Enemies Act. So what's the Alien Enemies Act? So whenever there's a declared war between the United States and a foreign nation, or an invasion or predatory incursion, the president should make proclamation of such an event, and non-citizens will be able to be removed as alien enemies. So the whole contention of this lawsuit is that Trump used the Alien Enemies Act to get another type of expedited removal, but there's a lot of aspects of how that was done illegally. So this talks about how this act has been used only 3 times in American history, all associated with major military conflicts. So there's a legal challenge coming at this. So basically, Trump just declared that there was an emergency, but that is very debatable as to whether there's an actual emergency there. And so that's the basic point. We'll also get a little bit more into the details after we hear a little bit more from Tim Pool.
Is, as it always has been, obviously not literally, you go back 200 years, immigration law was different. But as of right now, it's only 4 months and 3 months into the Trump administration. He did not change those rules or make these laws.
So, as I just demonstrated to you, he is trying to expand the power of the expedited removal that is currently under challenge. So he is trying to change the rules. And also the rules for expedited removal are applied to limited circumstances that did not apply in Abrigo Garcia's case.
This is how we've always handled it. I mean, how else do you think Obama was called deporter-in-chief? They weren't having trials for every single illegal immigrant. Trump did not make up this rule. What's happening now is the media's lying. They're saying, Trump, these illegal immigrants should get trials. And Trump is saying, no, they shouldn't. We have to deport them. The media is now acting flabbergasted. Donald Trump is saying no due process for illegal immigrants.
There is due process for illegal immigrants who've been here a long time. I mean, if you just think about this situation logically, if someone literally just entered the country, you're not going to have a long legal process. They're just going to get kicked out. But if someone's been in this country a long time, there is going to be more of a legal process. That makes sense. That's the humane thing to do. So that's how it's been, and Trump is trying to change that by invoking the Alien Enemies Act.
I am sick of these evil, smarmy, lying scumbags whose sole intention is to burn this country to the ground. They are...
I mean, you can see that Tim Pool's being very emotional here. He's trying to appeal to your emotions, and he's not trying to logically argue this case. I think it's also just very unfair to paint the other side as wanting to burn this country to the ground.
Lying. They brought in tens of millions of illegal immigrants in violation of our laws.
So they brought in, that is also inaccurate. Tens of millions, that's an exaggeration.
Spitting in the face of the Americans who are to inherit this nation. And when Donald Trump gets elected to deport them, they are now lying, claiming it's always been the case that you get a trial.
It has. I mean, Tim Pool's getting really worked up here, but we have always had some degree of, cases before a judge. I think he's over-indexing a little bit on the trial versus hearing debate here. The fact that there's a trial related to Abrigo Garcia is because of the Alien Enemies Act. That's different than what he's talking about here. So he's like really over-indexing on that, but it's like a totally different issue at play related to the Alien Enemies Act.
A trial? You mean like a bench trial with adversarial courts, with legal defense? That has never been the case. They're lying. They are reframing the system so that Donald Trump will be hamstrung and unable to deport the people they allowed into this country.
All right, so I've basically broken down his argument here. So the case of Abrigo Garcia, it's important to understand exactly what's happening here. So I'm going to just go into a bit more detailed explanation of what's happening. This is fact-checking website is a pretty good description. So, okay, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration must facilitate the release of Kilmar Abrigo Garcia, who was deported without a hearing to a mega prison in El Salvador. Okay, so this underscores the issue of due process and what legal protections are afforded to non-citizens. All right, so first thing, Trump administration said that Abrigo Garcia was accidentally deported due to an administrative error. So if you watch the rest of this video, there's a whole thing about how Christy Nome claims that he's a member of MS-13 and so on, and these claims don't stand to scrutiny. The Trump administration hasn't demonstrated these things in court. So I think just one thing to think about, Trump's basic way of doing things and that he's always do is he's the type of person to never back down. And I think that's something that a lot of people like about it. But if you think about the power of deporting people, having someone who never backs down even when they're wrong is really dangerous precedent. And that's why people are so upset. Okay, so then, there's this argument about, like, it's in El Salvador's jurisdiction, so we can't do anything. So why hasn't the Trump administration acted to secure Mr. Abrigo Garcia's case? Well, basically, they don't want to admit that they're wrong. Okay, so then we talk about there's limits to due process, so the Borders argues that detainees' rights may have a limited due process if they are determined to have gang affiliation. So that kind of goes back to this Alien Enemies Act. These gang members are invading our country, and that is why we are able to invoke the Alien Enemies Act. People who are enemies of the United States do not have the same level of due process as a normal process. Okay? So what is due process? Here's the thing about due process. If you can just deport somebody without any discussion, how is someone able to determine if they're a citizen or not? How do we know if someone's a citizen? How do we know if somebody has a granted asylum or other legal reason that they're allowed to be in this country? All right. So for continuing on, so previously expedited removal had applied to people who were apprehended within 100 miles of the border within 14 days of having entered the country. However, Trump is trying to expand expedited removal shortly after coming into office. However, this policy is being challenged as a violation of due process. So basically, Trump's trying to expand the ability of expedited removal in multiple ways. All right, so let's go to Abrigo Garcia. He came to the U.S. without authorization in 2012, and he claims that he was fleeing gang violence. He went to live with his brother in Maryland, and then in 2019, he was arrested. They moved to deport him, and then because he was in the U.S. without having been legally admitted, he applied for asylum. Okay, so then there's a discussion about whether, he was found to be part of MS-13 and so on. So during his asylum case, there's a question of whether or not he should be freed on bond. So once you're making part of the process, you could be held in jail or you could go out on bond. And so then he'd been in the U.S. for 8 years. So again, the expedited process wouldn't typically apply to him. And then DSHS argued that he should be kept in custody pending the outcome because he was allegedly a member of MS-13. This has been denied, and so this whole court proceeding, well, it's really a bond hearing, you could say. There was some evidence presented that he was a member of MS-13. So first, at the time of his arrest, he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and the hoodie with rolls of money covering the eyes. Okay, officers thought that was indicative of Hispanic gang culture, his arrest record said. Second, in a statement from a now suspended officer who cited a unnamed informant that Abrego Garcia was a member of the gang's Western clique. Okay, so does that seem like convincing evidence to you? I don't think so. All right, let's continue. So then there's more. So in his immigration case, there's some more things there. And so the immigration judge who handled his bond hearing said that this evidence seemed to be trustworthy while also acknowledging that there are inconsistencies in the report, and the judge denied the bond, and he didn't make a formal ruling on whether he was part of MS-13 or not. The courts didn't rule on that issue. Rather, they just said that information was enough to deny bond. So when you talk about the legal system, there's different levels of certainty that you need to do different things. So whether or not to hold him on bond has a lower degree of certainty that you need to do that. Okay, so then there was another thing that happened. The judge didn't rule on the issue of whether he was a member of MS-13. So Kristi Noem goes on to argue there was two immigration judges that ruled that he was part of MS-13. That is just a lie. Okay, so his asylum was denied because he filed it too late. He had been in the U.S. for 7 years already. However, he did get granted a withholding of removal. So since the court found that he was likely to face persecution, he got this withholding of removal. So, the government didn't appeal that ruling, and he's been living and working in Maryland ever since. So, as you remember, Tim Pool said very explicitly he was ordered to leave the country. That's just not true. Sounds convenient to his argument, but just isn't true. All right. So, recently he was arrested, and ICE just told him that his status had changed. So there is no legal grounds for his arrest, detention, and removal. And there's just been a lot of misrepresentations ever since. So just going back to Tim Pool here and thinking about this, he is getting really upset and emotional about the situation. There is an argument to be had about legal immigration. I think one thing that has kind of got lost in the news, so right before Trump was elected, there was a bipartisan border bill. So Democrats and Republicans had been negotiating for a long time, and they came up with a border bill which, among other things, expanded funding to have more border control agents, which is something that everybody agreed would be a good idea. However, Trump came in and killed that bill, basically because he didn't want the Democrats to have a win, which in effect means that the American people didn't have a win. We didn't fund more border agents to properly secure his border, and so Trump really just wanted to run on this issue and didn't want there to be any progress. So if you're a Tim Pool viewer, I hope that this was informative to you. You should be very careful when listening to things. You can see he makes a lot of emotional appeals. He gets upset. He gets angry. He presents a limited amount of evidence in describing what's happening. And so you should really be skeptical when you watch him in the future. Here's another thing. He went to the White House and has been getting talking points from the Trump administration. They are wanting to fight this thing hell or high water, regardless if they're right or not. So I hope that was interesting and informative to you. This is Left on Right. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments I'd love to discuss with you in the comments section, please share it with other people who you think consume right-wing media. The whole goal of this is to try and come to a mutual understanding between the left and the right. I review lots of different right-wing commentators. Some are more or less emotional, more or less rational than Tim Pool, and I hope that we come to a better place in this country. So thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.